Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Sheltering in place in San Francisco. Congress could reach a deal on that $2 trillion stimulus plan before the end of the day. Meantime, we are waiting for the daily White House briefing on the coronavirus, scheduled to start about a half hour from now. A monster rally in stocks today, in part on hopes of this stimulus plan coming through. I want to bring in our What You Missed co-anchor, Romaine Bostick. Romaine, walk us through the day. Why the big uptick?
Yeah, obviously, well, really two things, Emily. The two catalysts, actually, first, of course, it started with all eyes on Washington, waiting to get that almost $2 trillion stimulus package. We got some encouraging signals from Senate leaders, including Chuck Schumer, as well as Mitch McConnell, that this thing was being worked out and that we could potentially see a vote today in the Senate, which, of course, it would then go to the House and potentially to the president's desk before the end of the week. Also, we had the president talk about reopening the economy, effectively reopening it by Easter Day, April 12th here in the U.S. That's less than 3 weeks away. A lot of people took that as an encouraging sign that economic activity, if it didn't necessarily get back to normal, it would at least start to normalize. And I want to give you two numbers here, too, because we saw the S&P rally big time, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average had its best day going back to 1933. I know none of us are old enough to remember what was going on back in 1933. But I want to point out that on that date that we had that big rally in the Dow on March 1933, that was just 2 days after we had that first fireside chat from FDR, and he sort of put some optimism back into the market, back into the economy about what the government was going to do to support the economy. We're kind of, obviously, this isn't as great as what happened there in the Great Depression, but we're seeing sort of shades of that now here in 2020, where the market is sort of waiting on the government, on the Washington, to sort of do something to boost the economy. I also want to point out 2014. That was the date where we created the New York FANG Index, which, of course, tracks the expanded FANG complex, 10 stocks out there, Emily. And today was the biggest one-day gain on a percentage basis that we've seen on that index since it was created. We've seen a lot of people heading back into those growth stocks, heading back into those large cap, mega cap tech stocks. We saw Apple's market value go back above $1 billion. We see Microsoft still hovering above that $1 trillion, I should say, $1 trillion mark for Apple. I don't want to shortchange them, Emily. And of course, we have Microsoft holding at that $1 trillion mark as well. Monster moves in Tesla, Amazon, Nvidia, and the whole complex there. Some people looking at this as a sign of confidence here, but we should point out we've been here before. We've seen these big rallies only to be met with a sell-off the next day. We'll see whether this carries over tomorrow into tomorrow's session, Emily.
Well, and Romaine, another sign of confidence. You mentioned Apple rallying big time. Our Bloomberg Tech reporter, Mark Gurman, broke the story that Apple is considering reopening stores in the first half of April. However, still a lot of controversy about whether the economy should be reopening at this point, despite the fact that President Trump may want to do so. How does the market make sense of that?
Well, I'm not sure the market is making sense of it. Right now, the market is really looking for any optimism out there, and they're hanging on to it. I can tell you on some of the previous programs here on Bloomberg, we've talked to several doctors, scientists, who've basically said that it's going to be very difficult to meet that sort of Easter deadline that President Trump wants to get. We haven't really sort of reached the peak of what scientists think will be the number of cases. Keep in mind, testing here in the U.S. really hasn't even rolled out to the extent that we've seen testing in Asian nations like in South Korea and China and even in Europe. So there is some concern that the nation may not necessarily, from a health perspective, may not necessarily be ready to open up. But again, the idea that you're hearing this type of tone coming out of the president, coming out of other figures in Washington, this idea that they really do want to protect the economy and get it back up and running, that's enough for some people to say, all right, maybe, possibly, potentially, the worst may be over.
All right, Romaine, hang on. I want to get in some more insight on this market swing from Eric Knudsen, Neuberger Berman, multi-asset class CIO. Eric, as you heard Romaine mention there, we do not have an accurate picture of the outbreak here in the United States because testing has lagged and people who want to get tested simply cannot get tested. We're still seeing, really disturbing number of deaths coming out of Italy, coming out of Spain, and yet the president is talking about reopening the country before we know the extent of the outbreak here. How do you make sense of that as an investor?
Yeah, I think you hit the key points that until we gain some clarity on the path of the virus, there is going to be so much uncertainty around the impact on GDP growth, the impact on earnings growth, that we will continue to see an extended period of volatility. And that volatility can be up days, it can be down days. The rally today is certainly very nice. It puts some confidence back into markets, but we think that it is too soon to say that we have the all clear.
I want to talk about tech in particular. We saw a big rally in Apple, Microsoft, Tesla. Do you see those particular rallies sustaining, or are they going to be vulnerable to the swings, the gigantic swings that we've been seeing on a daily basis?
We think that all risky assets are going to be vulnerable to the kinds of volatilities we've seen really over the last month and several months. That the key predicates we are looking at before we can get comfortable increasing risk in client portfolios have to do with, first of all, understanding the path of the virus. That's going to take at least another 6 to 8 weeks in this country. Second will be the understanding the impact on GDP growth and earnings per share. And certainly major drivers of that will be the degree and magnitude of stimulus and how that stimulus is implemented. So certainly the rally today on the potential expectation of a large stimulus program is somewhat merited, as well as the potential that if we get back to work sooner, then that will limit some of the downside to GDP and earnings growth. We expect GDP growth to be worse than negative 10%, maybe around 13% negative in the second quarter, and earnings per share to take a 25 to 35% hit this year. That's going to, there are going to be a lot of negative headlines yet to come as we get to the path where we can understand those numbers, where we can get a sense that the virus has peaked and start to look through this. So we expect volatility to be around for at least another month or two.
So, Eric, talk a little bit about that and really this idea of what the guiding light's going to be. I mean, we know we're going to get this economic data rolling out over the next few weeks that are going to show some pretty dire numbers. We're getting earnings going to start coming out. It's not really clear how helpful those results are going to be to sort of getting a glean on what's going to happen in the future. So what's your guiding light here in terms of looking at fundamentals, looking at economic data that will give you a better sense of sort of where the economy is and where some of these companies stand?
Well, we're looking at market indicators and market activity first. And so obviously from a fundamental standpoint, as I said, you need to understand the path of the virus. You need to have some sense around GDP growth and earnings per share. But before that, we need to see liquidity return to components of the markets. We've seen it in treasuries. We're starting to see evidence that mortgage-backed and corporate credit will normalize, although we're still a ways from that. We need to see volatility start to come down in markets, and it's off the peak, but volatility has a memory. It's likely that volatility will stay high for a period of months before we go back to more normal levels of volatility. And finally, we're looking for a bottoming pattern in equity markets. We think that it is quite possible that the lows in the S&P 500 could be in the low 2000s. So we need to see an establishment of bottoming in the markets, and then we can turn to these more fundamental drivers of economic activity.
All right, Eric Knudsen of Neuberger Berman, thank you so much for your insights, along with our very own Romaine Bostick. We'll see where the market swings tomorrow. Coming up, we're going to head to D.C. We're going to get the latest on that stimulus package. Plus, we're going to talk about Vice President Joe Biden's campaign, how it evolves in an all-digital world as the traditional methods of campaigning get thrown out the window with the coronavirus. Meantime, we are standing by for that press conference at the White House. The daily coronavirus briefing will take you there momentarily. This is Bloomberg. President Trump now saying he wants to reopen the U.S. economy by mid-April. This, as the head of the World Health Organization says the U.S. may become the next hub of the outbreak, and that, in fact, the pandemic is accelerating. I want to bring in Bloomberg News' Laura Davison from Washington. So, Laura, give us the latest on the president's thinking here, given that we most certainly do not have an accurate view about just how widespread this outbreak is in the United States, given the lack of tests.
Well, definitely down Pennsylvania Avenue at the Capitol building, lawmakers are prepping for an economic downturn and people staying home for much longer than that. They're right now in the Senate in the final stages of finalizing a negotiation between Republicans and Democrats that would expand unemployment insurance. They're looking at months for that, 4 or 5 months more for unemployment insurance, short-term loans for businesses that would go through the end of the year, giving them deferrals on some of their tax payments. So at least on the lawmaker side, they're looking and saying, look, we need to prepare both families, individual households, as well as businesses for an economic downturn that could last for months or years based on the virus and people staying home and businesses really suffering a hit there.
Meantime, you've got the vice president's chief of staff saying that they're hoping that the goal would be to reopen the economy by Easter. They're continuing, however, to listen to healthcare experts. That said, the experts are contradicting what the president is saying here, or at least the goal that he is setting. So how do we expect this to play out?
That's a really good question. So next week is when the end of the 15 days that Trump had announced earlier, the 15 days stay at home, school your kids at home. And you hear from his experts when they come out and speak with him, Dr. Birx, Anthony Fauci, they have kind of said, look, this is going to be a longer thing. We need to look at the data. And Trump is sort of looking and saying, well, I wanted to get the economy going. I think more people are going to die from suicide, he suggested, than would die from the virus if the virus spreading and more people dying. So you really see a disconnect of health experts saying, look, this is going to be bad if we just sort of open up all commerce and schools and businesses versus Trump, who also, of course, has an eye on his reelection and the economy playing very heavily into that, has some incentive to say, you know what, let's move forward on the economy, perhaps at the expense of public health.
So give us the latest on the stimulus plan. Do you expect to see a deal in the Senate by the end of today?
Well, a deal is a very loose term. It is very possible that we see a deal, or at least an announcement that there is a deal. Getting the actual text of that bill may spill into tomorrow. There were, even just as of 20, 30 minutes ago, still some open issues that were being negotiated. They're working out the language. They're trying to get all of that checked and all sides happy with it. It's possible to come out tonight, but these things usually take a little bit longer than estimated, and we could easily see this bill into Wednesday.
All right, Bloomberg's Laura Davison for us in Washington. Laura, thank you so much for that update. Meantime, the coronavirus is ushering in a new era of political campaigning, and Vice President Joe Biden, the leading Democratic candidate, is trying rapidly to adapt. I want to bring in the digital director of President Obama's reelection campaign, Teddy Goff, now the founding partner of Precision Strategies. Teddy, it's so great to have your perspective here. First of all, talk to us about how well positioned the vice president is to make this switch. As you can't hold campaign rallies, you can't meet with people in public, you can't shake hands, which is something that Joe Biden has always been pretty good at.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I think it's a weird time in politics, just like it's a weird time in business and everywhere else. I think there's a lot of challenges associated with having to sort of throw out every plan that they had, presumably for the next month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever it's going to be, and figure out how to do everything remotely. I also think there's a big opportunity there. I mean, the entire country is stuck at home, spending even more time with our devices than we usually did, which was already quite a lot of time. And that's a lot of attention that a campaign that does it right can grab. And I don't think that's going to be easy. I mean, we're all focused on one thing right now. And by the way, a whole lot of people probably aren't that inclined to donate to a campaign or do some of the other things that a campaign needs. But we are kind of tethered to our phones more than usual. And I think that creates an opportunity to do some cool stuff and reap the benefits.
That said, Biden's campaign rushed to put together a TV studio in his home. He gave a live update on how he believes this coronavirus epidemic should be handled, and yet none of the major networks took that broadcast. You had like tens of thousands of people tuning in. Meantime, you have President Trump on television every day and in front of America's faces. So is Biden at a disadvantage here, given how expertly the president himself has managed to use technology despite never sending an email?
Well, I think what you're talking about is more of a condemnation of the mainstream media than it is a compliment to Trump or or a diss on the Biden campaign, in my opinion. We all know that the president is peddling disinformation at these once or sometimes twice daily, 2-hour long press conferences every day. And I think the cable networks ought to stop covering them. And I do think there ought to be, at minimum, parity, in terms of their live coverage of Trump and their live coverage of the Democratic Party, and it's increasingly likely who our nominee is going to be. I do think, in point of fact, there's a disadvantage there. I mean, you are exactly right. We've got a whole bunch of networks covering Trump live a couple hours a day, and the former vice president's having to sort of build an audience from scratch on his digital platforms every day.
So talk to us then. Biden isn't the nominee yet. You've still got Bernie Sanders out there, who seems to be doing a pretty good job tapping into this online moment. He's got upwards of 5 million people dialing into his online rallies. Is Senator Sanders better equipped here than the vice president to take advantage of this?
Well, Senator Sanders is, I think, probably the best digital candidate I've seen in my lifetime. And I'm a Obama person, so it's a little hard for me to say, but I think that's true. So obviously he has some kind of an advantage. And if you've got millions and millions more followers than your competitor, that means there's millions more people who are likely to get a notification or see it on their feed when they log into Facebook or whatever it is that you're live. And that just means more people are going to tune in. So, obviously, the Vice President Biden has a disadvantage in that he was in office, in the vice president's office for 8 of the kind of formative years in which a lot of other politicians were building up their followings. And that means he's got less of an audience to bank on.
Let's talk a little bit about Facebook, since you mentioned that, leading up to this, you had candidates like Mike Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, spending big time on Facebook ads. But, those candidates, Mike Bloomberg, of course, the founder of Bloomberg LP, the parent company of this network, they didn't seem to make a dent when it came to votes in the primary. Does that have something to say about Facebook and the value of Facebook ads?
I guess for me, that says a little bit less about the value of Facebook ads than it does about the value of ads in this current political moment in America. I don't think that you can point to television ads as having had much more of an effect on the primary outcome as Facebook ads. In fact, the founder of this network that I'm on was reported in the Times over the weekend to have had 5 times more on television ads than he did on digital ads. And that obviously didn't yield him the nomination either. So I don't think it's a question of channel. I think for me, we're in a period of time in which we've got to rethink our old assumptions about what works and what doesn't work in politics. And it's obvious that money overall, no matter how it was spent, didn't work in this particular, or didn't sort of determine the outcome of this particular primary. It was a weird primary. So I'm not sure that you can conclude from this one that next time there's a competitive primary, the highest spender won't win. But obviously, it's the case that in this primary, neither Facebook ads nor TV ads nor a big, field presence in Iowa or any of that seem to, determine the outcome. And I think everybody who's in my line of work needs to think long and hard about what that means for, the job that we do and what the value of it is and how we ought to make decisions.
All right, Teddy, fascinating to have your perspective here today. The digital director for President Obama's re-election campaign. Teddy Goff, thank you so much. Coming up, we're going to be talking about Amazon suspending almost 4,000 sellers for price gouging. And we're going to take you back to D.C. We are waiting President Trump, speaking of airtime, for him to appear at the daily coronavirus briefing. When that starts, we will take you there. This is Bloomberg. Amazon has said it suspended almost 4,000 sellers for price gouging on its e-commerce website. I want to bring in Bloomberg Spencer Soper, who covers Amazon in Seattle. So, Spencer, price gouging has been a problem now for weeks. Amazon has tried to crack down here and there. That didn't work, apparently. And now they're taking even more dramatic steps. What's exactly happened here?
Yeah, so they knocked down about 4,000 sellers, and that's about the best Amazon can do right now, is kind of play whack-a-mole. They have to just kind of have actual teams assigned to monitoring the site and watching for items that are for sale at inflated prices and then individually knock those down. It's a common theme for them, like we've seen it happen in hurricanes and in previous kind of natural disasters. Basically, they just have to show regulators that they're taking some kind of action to police this so that they're seen by regulators as kind of like an ally in fighting this as opposed to a perpetrator.
So how well has this worked? I mean, a cursory search of Amazon, and you still see inflated prices here and there for hand sanitizer and bleach wipes. Is this actually going to work?
Yeah, like I said, it's just going to be whack-a-mole. The best they can hope is to deter the activity, send a signal. Some people get suspended, word gets out. Other people, are discouraged from doing it. Just like the regulators, they'll find a few shopkeepers here and there and potentially even arrest some here and there and hope that discourages other people from doing this. But yeah, I mean, you're never gonna wipe it out entirely. Another thing to consider is that the state laws vary. Some states don't have any price gouging laws at all. The ones that do, they cover different types of products, generally food and fuel. So the rules are all over the place. It's a very difficult thing to believe.
Meantime, Spencer, I saw an interesting analogy that what Amazon is trying to accomplish now, it's sort of like Black Friday or Cyber Monday happening every day, and they didn't have months to prepare like they do for any typical Black Friday or Cyber Monday. Talk to us about how well Amazon is actually managing this right now. We know that Bezos is having these daily brainstorming sessions about what they can do better, but it certainly seems that, while they are making some dramatic moves here, it's still just really hard to get the stuff that you need and get it, quickly.
Yeah, Amazon is in the middle of this crisis just as much as anyone else. They're seeing the surge in demand, and like you say, at a time that's usually fairly slow. They're also managing a panicked workforce. So, we're seeing the coronavirus spread and confirmed cases in its different facilities. So now you have workers that you need more than ever are full of self-doubt on their own. Is it worth me even going to work? And absenteeism and people calling out being a problem. So Amazon is in crisis mode, and we know that 2-day delivery is just not an option right now. They're doing the best that they can under the circumstances, but those circumstances seem to be getting worse before Amazon can get ahead of it.
All right, Bloomberg Spencer Soper for us in Seattle. Thanks so much. Coming up, we're going to get a view on the burgeoning credit crisis with the CEO of Credit Karma. And we're going to take you to Washington. That press conference is supposed to start momentarily, where we will likely get a glimpse of the president, his latest thinking on when to reopen the economy, whether to reopen the economy. We will take you there as soon as it starts. Credit Karma CEO coming up. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. You are looking at a live shot of the White House press room where President Trump is scheduled to appear momentarily for the daily coronavirus briefing. When that starts, we will take you there. Meantime, we're going to some headlines out of the State Department. The State Department planning 40 flights to pick up about 3,400 Americans who have been stranded abroad in the middle of this pandemic. We'll continue to bring you headlines on that as we get them. Meantime, we are waiting for this $2 trillion stimulus package, for a deal to be reached on that in the Senate. This as the IRS has extended the tax filing deadline in the United States to July. I want to bring in the CEO of Credit Karma now, Kenneth Lin, to give us a view on what's happening for Americans out there as they feel this credit crunch. Kenneth, thanks so much for joining us. Of course, Credit Karma, is an interesting gauge of what's happening in consumers' lives right now, what's happening in their pocketbooks. Are you seeing a decrease or increase in app usage right now? And if so, how much?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing an increase, and we think that's actually going to go up further. So if you think about it now, people are just getting used to this notion of sheltering in place. And I think once people get over the notion that there is no toilet paper shortage, people are going to start thinking about what happens with their finances, what happens next. And I think that's what the realization that most Americans are coming to.
So how much of an increase are you seeing? And are you seeing an increase in people accessing their credit lines? And if so, how much?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot more application. I think what we're seeing specifically are a lot more people looking into personal loans. I think most Americans are realizing that this might go on for a protracted basis, and people are trying to shore up their overall financial situation. So we're seeing, roughly double-digit increases in personal lending applications. Now, I think the counter of that, we're seeing slightly less credit card application. And a note here is fewer people are transacting because people are sheltering in place, and as a result, credit cards become slightly less utilized. Personal lending and having dollars in your checking and savings accounts becomes more important.
Meantime, the tax filing deadline has been extended. What impact do you think that will have?
Well, there's a couple of things, right? So first, it's been extended to July 15th, and that's important. And this is a ever-changing thing, but the filing has been extended to July 15th, but also the payment has been extended to July 15th. And that's important because it preserves more cash in consumers' pockets. And again, right now, cash is king. With the way that the markets are, with the credit markets, they're kind of frozen because we don't know what unemployment's going to look like. And I think what the government and what the IRS is planning on here is giving people a little bit more relief if you have, cash that you have to pay. Holding on to it a little bit longer is another sense of security. I think that's fundamentally important. And I should just note that right now it's the federal pieces that have changed. New York and California has followed, but each state is still varied as they're trying to catch up to the federal government.
Now, you started Credit Karma in the middle of a recession, and this wouldn't be the first time that Americans in recent history have seen stimulus checks. President Obama sent stimulus checks. George W. Bush sent stimulus checks. In your view, do these checks actually work for everyday Americans?
Well, I think they help bridge the short-term, gaps. And you have to keep in mind that, roughly speaking, a quarter of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Roughly half of Americans don't have $400 in savings. So, $1,000 or $1,200 stimulus check goes a long way relative to where people are. But with that said, I think that it's only a short-term fix. Consumers really need to hunker down. They're going to need to think about what are their necessities. They're going to need to make a budget, and they're going to have to preserve their cash. They're going to have to learn how to make their cash that they have on hand go further in this economic environment, because we don't know whether this is going to be a 3-month thing or a 9-month thing, or even an 18-month problem. And consumers need as much optionality, flexibility as possible.
Right. Nobody knows the answer to that question. A lot of folks have credit cards tied to airlines, airline miles, and rewards. I mean, when airlines aren't flying, you can't rack up points that way. How do you imagine that impacting some long-term credit card application choices here?
Well, I think even as a more broad picture, I think it's really important to realize that credit card companies generally model the default rate to be similar to the unemployment rate. And because we don't know what the unemployment rate is going into all of this, credit card companies in particular are very concerned about who do you lend to in a world where, a lot of small businesses might be hurting. And I think that's a problem that we're seeing. And again, I think for most consumers, that's why having a plan is really important. That's why extending your cash lines are important. I think this is why if you have a mortgage or a car, having the opportunity to refinance so that you can preserve your cash flow, those will be the important things that consumers should be thinking about.
The Fed's decision to cut rates, how's that impacting some of your services like your savings offerings?
Well, the yield has gone down quite a bit, obviously, and that is actually, reduce the incentive to save. But the reality is a lot of people need to pull those dollars out. Now, the good side is that although short-term rates aren't directly tied to things like mortgages, what you are seeing is the bond rates going. That is driving an influx in mortgage refinances. That's great for consumers. The problem here is I think a lot of mortgage capacity has already been eating up. So what you're seeing is, mortgage lenders aren't even able to pick up the phone. You're not able to get appraisers out. So it's good for business in the sense that it drives more of the refinancing necessary to rally the economy. The flip side of it is shelter in place, and the lack of resourcing makes the processing of those loans much harder. So that's the tension that we see in the marketplace.
All right, Kenneth Lin, CEO of Credit Karma, really important to have your perspective at this time. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, we're going to be talking about testing. What is the state of testing in the United States as the president makes this decision about reopening the economy? And we will take you to that press conference at the White House. This is Bloomberg. Lab scientists are warning that the U.S. won't reach full testing capacity for COVID-19 for at least another month because of shortages in testing kits, as well as skilled lab workers. Another month. I want to bring in our Bloomberg News healthcare reporter, Kristen Brown. So, Kristen, it seems like if you want to get tested, it's incredibly difficult to get tested right now. I'm getting notifications from my district that if you feel a little sick, you can't get tested. Don't get tested until you have to go to the emergency room. Give us the picture on testing right now in the United States and how that is likely to evolve over the next few days.
Right. So, I mean, I think a few things are happening here. At the same time that we are having companies come in, ramp up testing, put many different versions of tests out there, we are also seeing more and more cases of the coronavirus. We have more than 20,000 cases in New York alone confirmed at this point. So ramping up the number of tests produced just cannot at this point keep up with demand for those tests. So the CDC did expand guidelines to tell providers that they should use their best judgment, but at the same time, they are urging people to prioritize people who are very ill and have symptoms of coronavirus, or are people like healthcare workers that have been in contact with someone with the coronavirus, or has a pre-existing condition as well as moderate symptoms of the coronavirus. So right now, really trying to triage and figure out, of the limited number of tests that there are, who does it make most sense to give those to?
So why is there still a shortage? You know, is it because they don't have enough money to make the tests, enough suppliers to make the tests? You know, what is the very root of this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of different factors all coming together at once here right now. We have just, you need a place to make the tests, right? You need a facility that can just pump out thousands and thousands of tests. And this was capacity for manufacturing that none of the companies that make these tests were anticipating a month ago, right? So, I mean, we have companies rushing to put tests out there, but at the same time, we have cases in the United States growing exponentially, and that production just can't keep up with that demand. So I think that we will see some easing, but at this point, I'm hearing that doctors that even a week ago were able to give tests to people who just had mild symptoms are now saying, okay, go home, monitor your symptoms, check back in with us, because the number of tests is just, the shortage is increasing as the number of cases increases as well. So we're seeing
so
that.
So you're basically saying the testing situation is actually getting worse, not better.
I'm saying that as the number of cases grows, as the number of cases grows, the number of tests that are manufactured can't possibly keep up at the current rate, I think, is what we're seeing. And manufacturers are trying, and more tests are coming online every day. People are trying to solve the problem. There's some really good efforts being made. So I think that we'll see a little bit of easing of this issue in the near term. But at the current moment, we're seeing manufacturing capabilities and lab capabilities that just cannot keep up. We're also hearing from doctors who are saying that, a week ago, they were able to get test results back in 2 or 3 days. And now sometimes it's taking as long as a week. So the whole system is just really stressed, trying to work as fast as it can, but it's not working as fast as the virus is working.
All right, our Bloomberg News healthcare reporter, Kristen Brown. Kristen, thank you so much for that update. Now we're going to talk to one of the companies that is trying